My neighbour was obsessed with his lawn. He'd actually use a ruler to check if my grass was taller than his. One day, I caught him sneaking onto my property at 2 a.m. to trim a single patch of clover he didn't like. In response, I bought a bag of wildflower seeds and tossed them all over his perfectly manicured turf while he was on vacation. Now, his lawn is a chaotic meadow and he is absolutely losing his mind. A guy down the street hated that I parked my car in front of his house on a public street. He started putting orange traffic cones out every morning. Every day, I'd move them and park there anyway. Eventually, he bought a beat-up old boat on a trailer and parked it there permanently just so I couldn't. It's been sitting there for 3 years, rotting and collecting fines, just to spite me for parking there once. My neighbour complained to the HOA that my trash cans were visible for 2 hours after the garbage truck came. She sent photos with timestamps, so I started taking photos of her house every time a single leaf fell from her tree onto the sidewalk. I filed safety hazard reports daily. She eventually had to hire a professional leaf-blowing service to come twice a day just to keep me from reporting her again. I had a neighbour who hated my wind chimes. Instead of asking me to move them, he bought a giant industrial-sized fan and pointed it directly at my porch to make them ring constantly, hoping I'd get annoyed. I didn't. I just bought 10 more chimes of various pitches. Now, my backyard sounds like a haunted cathedral 24/7, and he has to wear noise-cancelling headphones in his own kitchen just to eat breakfast. My neighbour was convinced my fence was 2 inches over the property line. He spent $2,000 on a professional surveyor just to prove it. The surveyor came out and discovered that his entire garage was actually built 3 feet onto my land. I told him he didn't have to move the garage as long as he mowed my entire lawn for the next 5 years. He's currently on year 3 of being my personal groundskeeper. An old lady next door hated my loud car, which is just a standard Honda. To get back at me, she started feeding the local pigeons, specifically on the patch of sidewalk right next to my driveway. My car was constantly covered in bird droppings. I responded by installing a motion-activated owl decoy that hoots. Now the birds are gone, but she thinks the owl is a demon and calls the police once a week. The man living behind me complained that my outdoor security light was too bright. It wasn't, but I tried to be nice and dimmed it. He still complained. So I installed a motion-activated sprinkler system along the back fence. Now, every time he tries to peek over the fence to see if my light is on, he gets blasted in the face with cold water. He claims he's watering his bushes, but we both know the truth. My neighbour used to accidentally blow his grass clippings onto my driveway every time he mowed. I asked him to stop, and he laughed. The next time he did it, I waited until he went inside, got my leaf blower and blew every single clipping, plus some extra mulch, right into his open garage. He came out screaming, but he hasn't let a single blade of grass touch my driveway since that afternoon of cleaning. I live next to a woman who thinks she owns the street parking. She would leave passive-aggressive notes on my windshield if I parked too close to her driveway. I started printing out her notes, framing them in cheap plastic frames, and hanging them on my fence facing her front door. It's like a tiny art gallery of her own insanity. She hasn't left a note in months because she hates seeing her own handwriting. My neighbour hated that I had a compost bin because he claimed it smelled, even though it didn't. He started throwing his dog's waste over the fence into my yard in retaliation. I didn't get mad. I just bought a high-powered drone and started dropping the waste back onto his roof where he couldn't reach it. He spent a week wondering why his entire house smelled like a kennel before he had to hire a roofer. I had a neighbour who would call the city if my weeds got taller than 4 inches. She was a nightmare. One summer, I planted mint along the edge of our shared property line. Mint is invasive and grows like crazy. Within 2 months, her pristine flower beds were completely overrun with mint. She spends every weekend weeding it now, and every time she pulls one up, the smell of fresh mojitos fills my yard. The person in the apartment above me would stomp around at 3 a.m. When I complained, he told me to get over it. I realized our bathroom vents were connected. Every morning at 6 a.m., when I knew he was finally sleeping, I would place a speaker against the vent and play Baby Shark on a very low, muffled loop. He couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from and eventually moved out due to ghosts. My neighbour complained that my kids were too loud playing in the backyard during the day. He started playing polka music at max volume to drown them out. My kids, however, absolutely love polka music. They started choreographed dances to his revenge music. He was so frustrated that his plan backfired and made my kids happier that he stopped playing the music and hasn't spoken to us since the accordion incident. I have a neighbour who refuses to trim his tree branches that hang over my roof and clog my gutters. I asked nicely, but he said, trees are nature. So I waited for the fruit to ripen on those specific branches. I harvested all the peaches that were overhanging my property and made several pies. I didn't give him any, but I made sure he could smell them baking. He was furious, but legally those were my peaches. My neighbour used to let his dog poop on my lawn and never picked it up. I caught him on camera and sent him the video, but he ignored me. So I started collecting the gifts and placing them in a circle around his expensive lawn ornaments. I didn't use a bag, I just used a shovel to create a moat of poo. He got the message very quickly after he stepped in it while trying to move a garden gnome one morning. A lady down the block hated my untraditional mailbox, which was painted like a galaxy. She filed a complaint saying it lowered property values. After I was forced to paint it a boring brown, I painted my entire front door the exact same galaxy pattern. The HOA rules only covered mailboxes and house siding, not doors. Now she has to look at a giant nebula every time she drives past my house to go to the store. My neighbour always complained about the ugly view of my firewood pile. He wanted me to move it to the other side of the yard, which was inconvenient for me. Instead, I spent a weekend stacking the wood into a giant, perfectly shaped middle finger that was only visible from his second-story master bedroom window. He tried to complain to the city, but there's no law against artistic firewood stacking in our town. My neighbour used to keep his Christmas lights up and flashing until March. They shone right into my bedroom. I asked him to turn them off, but he said he liked the holiday spirit. I responded by buying a high-powered, motion-activated floodlight for my security. Now, every time his lights flash, my floodlight triggers and illuminates his entire living room like a sun. We reached a truce within 2 days. We share a driveway with a guy who thinks he gets the good side. He would park his truck at an angle, so I couldn't get my SUV out easily. I decided to buy a tiny, beat-up moped and parked it in the exact spot that blocked his truck's swing path. It was perfectly legal. He had to do a 10-point turn every morning just to leave for work. He eventually started parking straight like a normal human being. My neighbour complained that my outdoor grill was too smoky and ruined her laundry drying outside. I checked the wind and realised she was right, so I moved it. Then she complained about the smell of the food. That was the final straw. I started hosting a barbecue club every Saturday for the entire neighbourhood except her. The smell of ribs and brisket fills the air, and she is the only one not invited. I had a neighbour who would constantly borrow my garden tools from my open shed and never return them. I'd have to go hunt for them in his yard. I eventually bought a heavy-duty padlock for the shed and spray-painted "Not for Neighbours" on the door in neon orange. He tried to tell me it was an eyesore, and I told him it would stay there until my rake magically walked back to my porch. The rake appeared that night. My neighbour was a know-it-all who constantly critiqued my gardening. "You're watering too much," or "those flowers won't last." To mess with him, I bought high-quality silk flowers and planted them in my front garden. I would go out and water them every day. He was losing his mind, trying to figure out how these tropical orchids were surviving a frost. He eventually asked for my secret, and I just said, faith. The guy next door hated that my cat sat on the shared fence. He'd spray her with a hose. My cat is a jerk, but she's my jerk. I bought a specialized cat-safe, motion-activated sprinkler and set it up on my side of the fence, aimed at his favorite lounge chair. Every time he tried to spray the cat, he'd get soaked by my system. He thinks the fence is cursed now and won't go within 5 feet of the property line. A neighbor complained that my lawn decorations were tacky. I had 2 plastic flamingos. In response to her anonymous letter, I went to a bulk warehouse and bought 50 more flamingos. I arranged them in a tactical formation across my front yard, all facing her house. I even gave the lead flamingo a tiny plastic sword. She knows it was me, but since there's no limit on flamingos in the bylaws, she can't do a thing. My neighbor used to play his TV so loud that I could hear the dialogue through the walls of our duplex. I asked him to turn it down, and he told me to buy earplugs. So I looked up the universal remote codes for his specific TV brand. Every time the volume got too high, I'd use my remote through the thin wall to turn his TV off, or change the channel to C-SPAN. He thinks his TV is haunted and has replaced it 3 times. My neighbor complained to the city about my overgrown oak tree because it dropped acorns on his driveway. The city told him it was a protected species and he couldn't touch it. He was livid. I started helping by collecting every single acorn from my yard and neatly placing them in a pile right against his garage door every morning. It's not littering if I'm organizing them, right? He hates the sound of the crunch. I live next to a guy who hates modern colors. He complained when I painted my shutters a dark navy blue. He said it clashed with the neighborhood vibe. I found out he was planning to sell his house. On the day of his big open house, I put up a giant, neon-colored inflatable bouncy castle in my front yard and played techno music at a reasonable but noticeable volume. Not a single person made an offer that day. My neighbor used to let his kids leave their bicycles and toys in the middle of our shared walkway. I tripped over a trike once and bruised my knee. I didn't say anything. I just started moving the toys into creative positions, like putting the bicycle on top of his high hedge or hanging the hula hoops from his porch light. He had to get a ladder to get his kids' toys back. The walkway has been clear ever since. The woman next door complained that my bird feeder attracted annoying birds, like blue jays. She preferred pretty birds. I did some research and started putting out specific feed that attracts crows. Crows are incredibly smart and loud. I started feeding them daily, and now I have a murder of 20 crows that protect my yard and caw loudly whenever she steps outside. They also bring me shiny trash as gifts. My neighbor hated that I worked on my hobby car in the driveway, even though I was never loud. He called the cops for a disturbance, but they said I was fine. To be petty, I started wearing a full tuxedo every time I worked on the car. I'd be under the engine in a bow tie and cufflinks, sipping sparkling cider from a flute. He looked like an idiot, calling the police on a man in a tuxedo, causing a scene. My neighbor across the street always leaves his high beams on when he pulls into his driveway, blinding me while I'm watching TV. I asked him to dim them, but he ignored me. I bought a giant decorative mirror and placed it in my front window at the perfect angle. Now, when he pulls in with his high beams on, the light reflects directly back into his own eyes. He figured out the physics of the situation very quickly. There is a guy in my building who leaves his smelly gym shoes in the hallway. The whole hall reeks. I started leaving scent reviews taped to his door. Monday, a bold bouquet of wet dog and regret, 2 10 stars. Tuesday, hints of old cheese and locker room floor, 1 to 10 stars. The entire floor started reading them and laughing. He was so embarrassed that he finally started keeping his biohazards inside his own apartment. My neighbour complained that my vegetable garden was messy and didn't fit the aesthetic of the street, so I redesigned the garden. I planted the corn, tomatoes and peppers in a specific layout so that from the street it just looks like a garden, but from his second-story window the different coloured plants clearly spell out the word boar in giant green and red letters. He sees it every single morning. My neighbour always tries to one-up my holiday decorations. If I put up one inflatable, he puts up 3. If I have white lights, he gets multicolour LEDs. Last year, I put up a sign that said, "Decorations are for losers" in small print, knowing he wouldn't read it. He immediately took down all his lights and inflatables to win at being minimal. I took my sign down the next day and put my lights back up. I won. The guy next door was obsessed with his perfect driveway and hated that my guest once turned around in it. He installed a literal no U-turn sign on his private property. In response, I bought a very realistic life-sized cutout of a police officer and stood it in my window facing his driveway. He spent 3 days driving perfectly under the speed limit and stopping for 5 seconds at his own gate before he realised it was cardboard.